Hi, I'm Dr. Robert Williamson Jr. I'm professor of religious studies at Hendrix College and the founding pastor of Mercy Community Church of Little Rock. I'm also the co-host of the Bible Worm podcast and the author of this little book, The Forgotten Books of the Bible, Recovering the Five Scrolls for Today. The idea of the Forgotten Books of the Bible is to look at five little scrolls of the Hebrew Bible, which are festival scrolls in the Jewish tradition, but which in my estimation have mostly been forgotten in the Christian tradition. And these books are Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. This video that you are currently watching is just a quick introduction to a 10-video series, 2 for each of those books, covering each of those 5 biblical texts that I talk about in the book. I'll give you a brief overview in this video, and then we'll dig in a lot deeper in the videos to come. These videos are intended for your use. You are welcome to use them for your class, for your book group, for your own personal study. However you find them useful, I hope you will use these videos to good effect. So I want to just dive in really briefly to the kind of the premise of the book and set the stage, and then I will let the other lectures kind of dig in a little deeper. The 5 books of the Bible that I am calling the Forgotten Books of the Bible are these: the Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. Now, each of these books in the Jewish tradition is associated with one of the Jewish holidays. So the Song of Songs is read for Passover or Pesach. Ruth is read on Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks. Lamentations is associated with Tisha B'Av, which is the day in which the Jews remember the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians, the first temple in 586 BCE, and all the other tragedies that have befallen the Jewish community since. Those are remembered on Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av. Ecclesiastes is read on Sukkot, or the Feast of Booths, and Esther is read on Purim, a holiday which is actually named in the book of Esther itself. Now, my premise in this book is that these 5 texts are really rich texts, and in the Jewish tradition, they have been elevated to the status of festival scrolls. They're part of the Jewish community's worship life, their faith life. They inform the imagination and the faith of our Jewish brothers and sisters and siblings. But in the Christian tradition, at least in the Protestant traditions in North America that I come from, these books are rarely talked about. They're rarely preached on. One of the things that I say is I can count the number of sermons I've heard on Lamentations without lifting a finger. You just don't hear Lamentations preached on very often. The same is true, I think, with the others of these books, with the possible exception of Ruth, which seems to be more popular than the others. But even then, it only appears in the Revised Common Lectionary twice. All the others appear only once. Now, my premise in the book is that if we would read these books of the Bible, they would say things to us about our life today. What does it mean to be a person of faith? I'm reading as a Christian. One could also read, what does this mean as a person of Jewish faith for our life in the world today? And so for each of these books, I try to connect with something, some kind of pressing issue in the world, and I try to read the book to sort of open up some possibilities about how these books might inform our faith and life. One of the things that I find is that these books are often doing something slightly different than kind of the big books like Genesis and Psalms and Isaiah and, the Gospels. These texts have kind of a different perspective sometimes on what is important and valuable. And my approach is those voices matter in the conversation. And so if they're in the Bible, we ought to listen to them. And so we need to go and read these books and let them be part of the chorus of the faith. So quickly, I look at the Song of Songs, first of all, as erotic love poetry. And I try to think about what does it mean that there is in the biblical canon a collection of erotic love poetry that celebrates human sex and sexuality and the beauty of human bodies. And so I try to read the book that way, and to say, in a church culture that is often kind of afraid of bodies and nervous about sexuality, how can this book help us embrace that part of ourselves in a more holistic and healthy way? I also spend a little bit of time reading the Song of Songs as it is traditionally read as an allegory of the relationship between God and Israel. And I kind of flip the poles of that allegory back and forth and read God as the male character in the song, and then, well, see what happens if you read God as the female character. And it is kind of a profound theological endeavor, if you ask me. The book of Ruth, I read in light of the crisis around immigration and refugees in our current world, which is also, I think, what Ruth was dealing with in its own time. Ruth is set in the period of the Judges before the monarchy is established, but many of us think it was probably written in the post-exilic period, actually, in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, when the Jews coming back from exile in Babylon were having a crisis of what does it mean to reestablish Israel and to make Israel great again. And one of the things they come up with is we need to expel foreigners from our midst. The book of Ruth then, in that context, presents the story of a Moabite woman, a foreigner, one of the kind of most suspect foreign peoples, comes into Israel and saves her mother-in-law, Naomi, in an act of commitment and devotion, and manages to not only save Naomi, but also to save the family line of Naomi's husband Elimelech, which ultimately produces King David. And so Ruth then is saying something about how immigrants have a foundational importance in Israel, and without Ruth, Israel never would have been great. And so I play around with that idea, both in the biblical world and in our own world. The book of Lamentations is written in the wake of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 586 BCE by the Babylonians. It's written from the perspective of the survivors. So you hear the voices of survivors talking about what has happened to them in the book of Lamentations. I try to show that Lamentations presents several different theologies. One which is basically a Deuteronomic theology of reward and punishment. We sinned, and so God punished us. But also there is another theology in the voice of daughter of Zion, the female personified city of Jerusalem, who says, look, even if I did something wrong, I didn't deserve what happened to me. Like the God has only been angry with us. And that's all she says. There is no turn toward faith. And then the communal voice shows up at the end of that book and tries to embrace, I think, both of those voices together, allow them to speak their truth without choosing between them. The book of Ecclesiastes deals with mortality and human anxiety about death. The basic idea of Ecclesiastes is that everything is breath, everything is vapor. And so we live our lives, we try to accomplish things, we try to earn money, we try to make a name for ourselves. And then we die, and in a few generations, if we're lucky, we are forgotten. Some of us are forgotten almost immediately. Some of us are forgotten a couple years down the road. If we build a monument, it's going to crumble. If we write a book, it's going to end up in the library with no one reading it. You know, whatever we try to do to secure a name for ourselves after we die, it's not going to work. And then Ecclesiastes says, so how do you live in a world where you can't make any profit, when there is no gain in life? And so it wrestles with that idea. And it concludes, I think, something about we really need to learn how to enjoy the moments of our lives instead of thinking of our lives as something that adds up to something in the end. Finally, the book of Esther is set in the Persian Empire, and it is dealing with what happens when anti-Judaism, or maybe you could think more broadly about ethnic nationalism, arises that has been sort of beneath the surface of the empire, suddenly bursts forth when some of its proponents come to power. In the book of Esther, in the person of Haman the Agagite, we see in the book of Esther resistance from Vashti, the queen of Persia, from Mordecai, the Jewish cousin of Esther, and then from Esther herself, the queen of Persia. And they work together in these interesting ways to undermine the patriarchal impulses of the empire, and also to thwart the ethnic nationalism of the time. And so I say, here's what this looks like in the book of Esther. What might this look like in our own time? So that's what I'm trying to do in the book. I hope you enjoy it and get something out of it. If you are using this book and you need some resources, here's a few good things that you should have in mind. First of all, there is a free study guide for the book that was written by Edie Williamson Bender and myself and published by Fortress Press. It is free and available on my website, which is rwjr.co. That's not a typo. It's just co. FBB, that is Forgotten Books of the Bible, FBB Study Guide. You can also find it on Fortress Press's website for my book. It's free for download there. It's just a PDF you can download. Second is this video series. You have found your way to at least the first one. There is a playlist with 10 other videos that you can find on my YouTube page at youtube.com/WilliamsonHendricks. And finally, there are episodes of my podcast that we are recording that go along with these texts. And those are available at BibleWormPodcast.com, or you can find BibleWorm wherever you download your or stream your podcasts. The relevant podcasts are episodes 43 through 52. All of those resources are available to you and free for your use, so I hope you will go and find them. If you're looking for me, you can find me at robertwilliamsonjr.com. You can find me on Facebook at robertwilliamsonjr.author, on Twitter at rwilliamsonjr. My podcast is at BibleWorm, BibleWorm Podcast, and you can get in touch with me at robertwilliamsonjr.com. Thanks so much for watching this introduction. I hope you find it interesting enough to propel you toward these fascinating books of the Bible, which really I think will enrich your life if you take the time to read them. So thanks for being here. I look forward to seeing you again soon.